get started? All right, Bruchim Habaim, a blessing of welcome on everybody who is here to commemorate Tisha B'Av with us, whether you're joining us in person or joining us through the magic of the internet. We're glad you're here, and I'm really glad to have Cantor Aviva Rosenblum is here as my partner in this service. In just a moment, we're going to get started with Mariv, which can be found in the even though it's a weekday Mariv, it can be found in the Shabbat prayer book on a page, and that page is 281. 281. We're going to tarry a little bit longer as the lights decrease outside. We're going to start this service with a song that's been selected by Cantor Aviva. And what I'd like to do is share the words of that song on our screen. If you'll bear with me for just one moment. I'm going to start with number one. All righty. So you have the song sheet, and please feel free when you catch the tune to join. Oh, it has the sources on there. Okay, let me stop that share and share something else. You'd think we'd be good at the internet by now.
You are.
Okay. Bless your heart. How's that? All right, good catch.
Okay, this is a round for Tisha B'Av. Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers of Babylon. Sham Yashavnu, there we sat. Gam Bachinu, and we cried, we wept. Bezochrenu et Zion, when we remembered Zion. So, if you don't know the song, at least you can sing the first three words. Al Naharot Bavel, Al Naharot Bavel. You can keep singing that. Al Naharot Bavel, Al Naharot Bavel. Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu Bezochrenu et Zion, Bezochrenu et Zion. Same tune in English. By the rivers of Babylon, by the rivers of Babylon. There we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion, when we remembered Zion. Al Naharot Bavel, Al Naharot Bavel. We're going to begin in our prayer book, and maybe we shared this in a link on the chat, or if you have it here, it's the Sidur Sim Shalom for Shabbat and Festivals. It's got the Saturday night weekday Amidah in the back on page 281, page 281, and it begins with Bechur Rachum, and then shortly after we'll rise for our call to blessing the Baruch. והוא רחום יכפר בם ולא ישחית, והרבה להשיב אפו ולא יאיר כל חמתו. אדוני הושיע, המלך יעננו ביום קוראנו. We rise for the Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamborach. Baruch Adonai Hamborach le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bivaro ma'arei v'aravim. ומפני חושך וחושך, מפני אור, ומעביר יום ולילה, ומבדיל בין יום ובין לילה.
אל חי וקיים, תמיד ימלוק עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני, המעריב ערבים. You may be seated if you wish, as we continue to bless God for God's constant love, Ahavat Olam. Ahavat Olam, Beit Yisrael, Amcha Avta, Torah u'mitzvot, hukim u'mishpatim, otanu limadeta. Al ken Adonai Eloheinu, b'shogvenu kumenu, nasiach bechukecha, v'nismak b'divrei Toratecha, ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ואורך ימינו. ובהם נגה יומם ולילה, יומם ולילה. ובתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. We can say the Shema together on page 282. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם להיות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. You can read the next passage at the bottom of 282 at your own pace. לתת להם כי מהשמיים על הארץ. We join together at the top of page 283. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל, ואמרת עליהם, ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת, והיה לכם לציצית וריתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני, ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם, אשר אתם זונים אחריכם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני Adonai Elohechem emet, emet b'emunah. We're at the bottom of page 283. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם, משה בני ישראל לחנו, שירה בשמחה רבה, ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדע בקודש, נורא תהילות אוסף אלה. מלכות קראו בניך בוקעם לפני משה, זה אלי ענו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר כי פרד יעקב, וגלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, גל ישראל. Page 284. Hashgivenu Adonai Eloheinu Shalom. V'hagim b'adinu v'chasenu. Ki elu shomrenu matzilenu ata. Ki elu melechonu baruchu ata. Ushmor tzeitenu bo'enu l'chaim u'l'shalom yata v'yad olam. Baruch ata Adonai. Shomer amo Yisrael la'ad. Baruch Adonai le'olam amen ve'amen. Baruch Adonai Tzivon. Ve'yimelech kavod kol haaretz amen ve'amen. Ki hoel Adonai la'asot etchem l'olam. Ve'yosot Hoshienu Adonai le'Eloheinu kol goyim asher asita. כי גדול אדוני עושה נפלאות, וענק ממך וצאן, לך לעולם לדור לדור, נספר תהילתך, ברוך אדוני ביום, ברוך אדוני בלילה. אלוהינו בשמיים, ומלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, יראו עינינו וסימנו. כי המלכות שלך כי ולעולמי תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בכבודו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון, ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בגלה, בגלה, ובזמן קריב, ואמרו אמן, יהי שמי רבה מבורך, לעולם ולעלמי עלמי יתברך, יתברך וישתבח ויפאר ויתרומם וינשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו לעילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמא ואמרו amen. We now go to page 286b for the Amidah for a weekday evening. This is a silent Amidah or a private Amidah. So pray the words on the page or the prayer that is in your heart or both. When you're finished with your private prayer, you may be seated and we'll get back together in just a couple of moments. Ose shalom bimromav. Hu yaseh shalom aleinu. Ve'al kol Yisrael. Ve'imru amen. Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael. We conclude the Amidah with the Kaddish Shalem on page 294, page 294. Yikra v'yikra shemei rabba, be'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayet u'chobet Yisrael, b'agala v'zman kari v'imeru, amen, yehi shmei rabba mevorach, le'olam olam me'almaya. Yitbarak v'yishtabak v'yipar v'yitermam v'ynaseh v'yitadar v'ytaleh v'ytalal shmei dekudesha brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran b'alma v'imeru amen yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imeru amen Ose shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel ve'imeru. Amen. Just a quick note, that's one variation for this time of year, is that for the Kaddish Shalem, after the Amidah, on Erev Tisha B'Av, we leave out that one line that distinguishes the Kaddish Shalem from the Kaddish Yatom. There's one line that's different, that's absent from the Kaddish Yatom because of the mournfulness of the occasion. It's kind of like when you're at a Shiva Minyan, Kaddish Shalem is also missing that one line. But like every service, we begin to end it with a Aleinu on page 297. Please rise. Aleinu leshabeach ladon hakol, latet gedula liotzer breshit, shelo asanu kegoye haratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot hadama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, vegoralenu kechol hamonam, V'anachnu korim u'shtachavim u'modim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu shehu notei shemayim v'yosed haaretz emet malkeinu v'vezot tzmitoch chateinu al ken nekavah lecha Adonai Eloheinu. המלכות שלך היא, ולעולמיה תמלוך בכבוד, ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד. If you're standing, you may be seated. This is a time in our service where we remember those who are no longer in this world with us. If you are in mourning or observing a yard site, I'll invite you to stand with us for Kaddish Yatom, the Mourner's Kaddish, on page 298. Page 298. Let's pray together. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, ba'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uvizman kariv vimru amen. Yehe shmei rabba mevorach leolam ulalmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei dekudsha brihu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, da'amiran bi'alma v'imru amen. Yehe shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. If you're standing, you may be seated. This concludes our Mariv service. And now we're going to have a little transitional moment. Cantor Aviva is going to share with us another song. And let's see if I can share the right screen. Here we go.
This is another version of By the Waters of Babylon or By the Rivers of Babylon. This is a song by a group called the Melodians that was popular a while back. But it has the same words as Al Naharot Bavel, because that's where we were sitting when we were mourning the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. For the wicked carried us away, captivity required from us a song. How can we sing the song of God in a strange land? For the wicked carried us away, captivity required from us a song. How can we sing the song of God in a strange land? So let the words of our mouth and the meditation of our heart be acceptable in thy sight, Adonai.
Shkoach. So at this point, I want to change gears just a little bit. For the people who are present, I've put together a little source sheet. We're not going. This is about 6 pages long. We're not going to cover every single little thing, but this is more of a little digest for you, and I'm going to share that on the screen as well. As I go through a few sources, my goal is to go over some places in our tradition, some touchstones in our texts among the writings of the sages of the classical period that talk about destruction, but also renewal. Now, the book, let's see, I'm going to share the right one any minute. There we go. So the Book of Lamentations is thought to be describing a particular event, and that is the destruction of the first temple. Even though the holiday of Tisha B'Av is kind of a catch-all of tragedy, if you will. It's said in our tradition that on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of the month of Av, this is the date where both the first temple was destroyed by most sources, 587 before the Common Era, but also on the same day of the year, the second temple was destroyed. The first by the Neo-Babylonians, so the Babylonians or the Neo-Babylonians, as some people call it, by the king Nebuchadnezzar. Was the first time, and the second was in the year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans, who were occupying the area of Yehuda or Judea at that time. So both of these things allegedly happened on the same calendar day of the year, as well as, by some accounts, many occurrences in the Shoah, many occurrences in the Crusades, many occurrences throughout Jewish history are said to have happened on the 9th of Av. And this insight was shared with me by a teacher of mine, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, who says, you know, statistically speaking, is it likely that all of these things happened on the same day? Not necessarily. But the rabbis, in their wisdom, took all of these different tragedies and decided, you know what, we're going to mark them all on the same day, as if they had happened on the same day. Because the fact is, if you marked the yahrzeit, if you marked the anniversary of every tragedy in Jewish history on the day that it happened, we would literally never stop crying. We would have lamentation, fast, mourning, sackcloth, ashes, punctuated by holidays and Shabbat. And so what we did out of psychological necessity was gather all these days together, and we mark them on one day of, let's say, super sadness, where we have a fast equivalent to Yom Kippur, except that it's not a Shabbat-like restriction on work. You can still work if you like, but we fast from food and water, from Na'alim Sandal, that is the wearing of leather shoes, not because of leather per se, at least according to classical sources, but because of the comfort that leather shoes provide. Bathing, marital activities, and things like that. We refrain from this as a day of mourning. And I say this advisedly because we're going to study just a little bit of Torah. They said, it's such a sad day, you can't do our favorite thing, which is study Torah, except Megillat Echa. We're not going to rule out Torah altogether. You can read the Book of Lamentations because it's the saddest book that we have. So, that said, what I want to do is take a look at a few classical sources. We're going to just delve into the Torah. Actually, we won't even read it, but it is in the source sheet you have in front of you, just so you know where to look it up later. I'm not going to read it out loud. But I am going to take a look at this commentary on this particular passage of Vayikra, from what's known as the Holiness Code, probably one of my favorite chapters in the Torah, certainly my favorite chapter in Leviticus, and that's chapter 19, where Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator known for his noting grammar for the most part, takes a look at this verse and the phrase, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart." This is a negative injunction, or a mitzvah lo taseh. That is the flip of the positive injunction in the following verse, "You shall love your neighbor." You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall love your neighbor. Now, all of these commandments are implanted in the heart. That's what he wanted to point out, is that these particular commandments of chapter 19, when God begins chapter 19 and says, "You shall be holy before I, the Lord your God, am holy," and here's how, and gives us a bunch of mitzvot, like not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind, not insulting the deaf, and not holding hatred in your heart. And Ibn Ezra says all of these are affairs of the human heart, meaning these are mitzvahs that sometimes only God can see if we're doing them or not. Does that mean that they don't have consequences? Ibn Ezra points out here a teaching from our tradition that we'll delve into a little bit more deeply, where he says, Israel will dwell in the land when they observe them, meaning those mitzvot that are only in the heart. Right? We don't, according to Ibn Ezra, merit dwelling in Israel because of the things that we do on the outside. We merit the promised land because of the things that we do on the inside. And how do we know this? As he goes on, for the second temple, Beit Sheni, was destroyed because of the hatred of one's neighbor for no reason, which is a translation of a phrase popular this time of year, sinat chinam, or baseless hatred. Now, our tradition gives two distinct reasons for the destruction of the two temples. This time of year, we often talk about sinat chinam. I was reading a commentary from a scholar in Israel named Gaffney, who is a renowned scholar of the rabbinic period and gets a lot of calls from journalists. And they say, isn't it true that we lost the temple because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred? And they want to get a quote from him as a renowned scholar of Talmud, so that then they can turn around and say, yes, baseless hatred lost us the temple, just like the baseless hatred of the opposition party for my politics. This is what Gaffney points out. Journalists actually hate to hear from him because whenever we say baseless hatred, we're never talking about we lost the temple because of our baseless hatred. We are usually saying we don't deserve the temple because of somebody else's baseless hatred for me. And Professor Gaffney disabuses them of that. But that's not why we say the first temple was destroyed. The first temple was destroyed, we say, because of, as it reports in Masechet Yoma in the Talmud on page 9, side B, due to what reason was the first temple destroyed? It was destroyed to the fact that there were three matters that existed in the first temple: idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Not the usual bloodshed of the temple, but human violence against one another. So sexual violence, human ending of life, and idol worship was present in the first temple, and that's why it was destroyed. Masechet Yoma goes on to point out, however, considering that the people during the Second Temple period were engaged in Torah study, because by then, after the exile to Babylonia, after the destruction of the First Temple, we began to study Torah more meticulously because we didn't have all those sacrifices to do without the temple. So we were engaged in Torah study, we were observing mitzvot, we were doing gimilut chasadim, we were doing acts of kindness. We weren't shedding blood in the temple. We weren't engaged in sexual violence. We weren't engaged in idolatry. So why should we lose the temple the second time? So the people were engaged in Torah study, observance of mitzvot, acts of kindness, and they did not perform the simple acts that were performed in the first temple. So why was the second temple destroyed? It was destroyed due to the fact that there was wanton hatred during that period, this sinat hinam, this wanton, this baseless hatred of one person for another. Not even acts of hatred, as those three acts were for the beginning, the first temple, but just hatred within one's heart. This comes to teach you that the sin of wanton hatred is equivalent to the three severe transgressions of idol worship, sexual violence, and bloodshed. By the way, these are the three big no-nos. These are the three things, and we've talked a lot about in the last 18 months and change about pikuach nefesh. how we have modified how we do services, how we have embraced technologies that we had set aside for Shabbat so that we could celebrate Shabbat together and save life. We, in this time, took on what we call the principle of pikuach nefesh. There's a teaching, pikuach nefesh doche Shabbat. Saving a life supersedes the requirements of Shabbat. In fact, pikuach nefesh, saving a life, supersedes almost all of the commandments except for three things: idolatry, sexual violence, and bloodshed or murder. These are the three things where if somebody says your life is forfeit if you don't do these three things, you're supposed to give up your life. That's how serious they are. And Masechet Yoma comes to teach that by the virtue of the fact that we lost the second temple, not because of any of these things, but because of hatred for one person to another in their hearts, this is equivalent on the scale to the three worst things that we can think of. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the baseless hatred that I'm talking about, I'm not going to tell the entire story. I did bring it in the text sheet here if you want to review it on your own. And if you're seeing this and you want to hit me up later, I'm happy to email this to anybody who lets me know, because I know it's hard to share over Zoom and the screen, but I have this sheet together. The baseless hatred that they're talking about is the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. It's a little bit confusing. Sometimes it takes a whiteboard to sort out Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Essentially what happens is this, I'll sum it up, is that a person has a dinner party and invites everybody except his nemesis, what's called. And his nemesis, or rather there's a confusion, and this nemesis shows up at the dinner party, and the guy says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, I got an invitation. You know, it was addressed to Kamsa, it came to Bar Kamsa, who knows? But I'm here. Can I just eat? I came all this way. Your friends can see me. It would be embarrassing if I had to leave now. And he says, well, be embarrassed. I don't care. Get out. This is my home. You're not welcome here. And he says, look, I'll pay for everything I eat. Just don't humiliate me. And he says, no, I don't care. Get out. And the guy says, well, I could see those rabbis right there. Rabbis, don't you agree that humiliation in public is the worst thing that you could do to somebody? And the rabbis are kind of looking at their fingernails. A couple of get up and go to the buffet. And the man leaves. And long story short, the man is so upset by what has happened to him that he contrives to give the emperor an animal to sacrifice at the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. So governor is in town, or not the emperor, the sort of the local governor of Judea. He says, here, take this to the temple, and before he takes it to the temple, the aggrieved man puts a defect in the animal, puts a pin in its eye so that its eye gets bloodshot, and it becomes ineligible for sacrifice. And so the local governor takes the animal to the temple, and again, they have a dilemma that, according to Hoyle, by the rules, they can't accept the governor's animal for sacrifice because it has a defect. And they appeal to the scholars, and they say, look, for the sake of peace, can't we just take this animal? And the scholars say, no, for the integrity of the temple, we cannot. And because the emperor was insulted, they say this was sort of the Franz Ferdinand moment. This is what precipitated the ultimate destruction of the temple, all because a guy gets embarrassed at a dinner party and somebody can't get over their baseless hatred. So it's at this time of year where we're reflecting on all of the manifold destruction that have befallen the Jewish people, where maybe we're most tempted to say, gosh, look at those terrible Babylonians. Look at those terrible Romans. Forget about those terrible pharaohs and Nazis and crusaders. All of those people outside of us who have brought upon this destruction. Our sages point us inward. Yes, we get to be sad. But we also need to reflect, when are we the source of our own sadness? I want to share with you one more text, and again, I give you the long version here. There's a lot of Aramaic going on here, but it's a very important and fruitful chapter of Avot de Rabbi Natan. It probably starts on about page 5 or 6 of your handout, page 5, where there are two of my favorite texts compressed in this one section. One of which is something that I've been thinking a lot about over the last year and a half. It appears in many prayer books in the beginning of the morning service, where we have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his student, Rabbi Yehoshua, are strolling outside of Jerusalem, and they can see in the distance the ruins of the temple. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, Oy lanu, woe is us, alas. We'll see that word again in a second. The Hebrew is echa. That our temple is destroyed, and we can no longer make up for our mistakes. We can no longer atone, because we can no longer do sacrifices. And his teacher, Rabban Yochanan, says, my son, don't be distressed. And I always point out that my son, Bani, is critical. It's relational. You have to own your relationship with someone to truly comfort them. You have to take ownership, take responsibility for those around you who are suffering. And he says, didn't you read Hosea in chapter 6, verse 6? Where it says, Hesed chafatzti v'lo zavach, for I desire kindness, says God, not sacrifices. This says, within our very destruction are the seeds of our redemption. Again, tonight we dwell on destruction. We read our saddest book from Echa, which is attributed to Yirmiyahu. It's attributed to Jeremiah because of the timing and because of the tone. It was probably more like current events of the time, people observing what it's like to be a city under siege. See, sieges weren't the everyday form of war back 2,500 years ago, except for those building empires. Often wars would be settled on the field and the cities would be left alone. Only warriors would suffer. But if you were trying to build an empire, and if you were trying to make an example of a people, you would undertake the great expense of laying siege, and sometimes it would take years to defeat a city by siege. It did in the case of Jerusalem. This wasn't an overnight thing. It took years for Nebuchadnezzar to sack Jerusalem. And in those years, water dried up. Food supplies were gone. The ability to bury the dead outside the city was gone. It begins to illuminate the graphic nature of Echa, why it was so terrible. And it was also an innovation in that sieges represented what's called total war, where not just the kings or princes who had a beef were attacking one another, not just the warriors suffered, but everyone suffered. And so we read Echa, we read of the victimization of total war as it reflects our experience then, as it reflects our experience under the Roman destruction, as it represents our experience under the Crusades and the Shoah, and so much in between. Even still, we can look at our ruin and say, what's the kindness that we can do today? What's our plan B? How do we move forward from this? And I'll conclude with that other passage that's in here in Avot Rabbi Nachman in chapter 4, section 5. The same rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when subjected to the destruction, this was before he walked in the garden with Rabbi Yehoshua, he managed to make it out of Jerusalem. And he did a solid for the emperor Vespasian, or as it's read in the Aramaic, Asphasinos. And Vespasian grants him a wish, as it were. And he says, if I could just have the scholars of Yavne, I know we don't get to keep Jerusalem, but just give me a chance and a few devoted people, and we'll be okay. And this was the birth of Rabbinic Judaism. This was the birth of the Judaism which would sustain us for the next 2,000 years. Because all we need is a chance. All we need is the lesson of kindness, and we can triumph over sinat chinam. All we need is the good side of our heart to triumph over the bad. That's what I wanted to share with you about our tradition's view at this time of year on the nature of destruction, suffering, and where it comes from, but also plant the seed of hope that in all moments of destruction, there are cracks that let light through. And that is how we will continue to thrive. I want to conclude this section of study with a song from Cantor Aviva, and then we will light some candles, and I'll talk about what's going on next. There's a custom for Tisha B'Av in the evening to light some candles if you wish, to sit on the floor or maybe a low step or something like that, as one does in mourning while we read from Echa, from the Book of Lamentations. But first,
They should get the...
yes, and if you want to grab one of these, we have these orange books over here that have the words of Echa in them, as well as some candles in the back there.
To prepare us for reading, I'm going to be chanting the entire first chapter of Echa, and some of the last chapters we're going to be reading some in English. I just wanted to prepare you for the last verse that we're going to chant. The very last verse that we're going to chant. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva, return us, God to you, and we will return Chadesh Yamenu Kekedem, renew our days as of old, and you may recognize this from other holidays. It's number 3 in the song sheet, and it goes like this. It's going to be the last verse we chant from Echa. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Eilecha, V'nashuva, V'nashuva, Chadesh, Chadesh, Yameinu Kekedem. And you'll listen for that at the end of the Book of Echa.
So what I'm going to do now is we have, if you want some candle, we have some candles and some matches back there. I have some candles and matches right here. And so we're going to make a little Havdalah, a little bit late, but the custom is for the Havdalah for Erev Tisha B'Av. We don't have wine because we're starting a fast day, or spices because those go on food. But we do say the blessing for distinction. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh l'chol. Oh, amen. Okay, so I'll ask our Zoom coordinator to go to our floor cam. As you'll see, Cantor Aviva and I will be, I'm going to stop the share here. Cantor Aviva and I will be sitting on the floor while we read selections from Echa, or the Book of Lamentations. We'll start with Cantor Aviva we'll begin with a bracha, begin with a blessing, and then chant the first chapter, the entire first chapter of Echa, and then I'll be sharing some selections of subsequent chapters in English, and then we'll continue, or rather we'll conclude with the final part of chapter 5.
The blessing starts the way most blessing starts, the way all of our blessing starts. And the end of it is Asher Asanu Asirei Tikva, who has made us captives of hope. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Asher Asanu Asirei Tikva. We praise you, sovereign of existence, who has made us captives of hope.
Amen.
And then the blessing for reading a Megillah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mikra Megillah.
Amen.
You know, it is the custom to take off leather shoes if you have them on. I happen to have plastic shoes on, so I'm going to leave mine on.
Okay. I've got my canvas Vans
Right.
for the holiday.
Canvas and plastic shoes. But those of you at home, if you want to take off your shoes and sit on the floor, feel free to do so. Echa yashva vadad ha'ir rabati am hayeta ke'almana Rabati vagoyim, sarati b'medinot, hayeta lamas. Bachot tivke balayla, v'dim'ata lecheya, en la menachem mikol oaveha. כל רעיה בגדובה היו לה לאויבים. גלתה יהודה מעוני ומרוב עבודה, היא ישבה בגויים, לא מצאה מנוח. כל רודפיה השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי באי מועד, כל שעריה שוממים, כהניה נאנחים, בתולותיה נוגות והימר לה. היו צריה לראש אויביה שלו, כי אדוני הוגה על רוב פשעיה. עולליה הלכו שבי לפני צר. ויצא מבת ציון כל הדרה. היו שריה כאיילים לא מצאו מרעה. וילכו ולא כוח לפני רודף. זוכרה ירושלים ימי עונייה ומרודיה, כל מחמודיה אשר היו מימי קדם. בנפול עמה ביד צר, ואין עוזר לה. ראו הצרים, שחקו על משפטיה. חטא חוטאה ירושלים, על כן לנידה הייתה. כל מכבדיה הזילוה, כי ראו ערוותה. גם היא נאנחה ותשב אחור. טומאתה בשוליה, לא זכרה אחריתה. ותרד פלאים, אין מנחם לה. ראי אדוני את עוני, כי הגדיל אויב. ידו פרס צר על כל מחמדיה. כי ראתה גויים באו מקדשה, אשר ציווית לא יבואו בקהל לך. כל עמה נאנחים, מבקשים לחם, נתנו מחמודיהם באוכל להשיב נפש. ראה אדוני והביטה, כי הייתי זוללה. לא עליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו ראו. אם יש מכאוב כמכאובי, אשר עולה לי, אשר הוגה אדוני ביום חרון אפו. ממרום שלח את אש בעצמותי וירדנה. פרס רשת לרגלי, השיבני אחור, נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבה. נשקד עול פשעי, בידו יסתרגו, עלו על צווארי של כוחי, נתנני אדוני, בידי לא אוכל קום. צילה כל אבירי, אדוני בקרבי, קרא עלי, מועד לשבור בחורי. גת דרך אדוני, לבתולת בת יהודה. על אלה אני בוכייה, איני יורדה מים, כי רחק ממני, מנחם משיב נפשי. היו בניי שוממים, כי גבר אויב. פרסה ציון בידיה, אין מנחם לה. ציווה על אדוני ליעקב סביביו צריו. הייתה ירושלים לנידה ביניהם. צדיק הוא אדוני כפיהו מריתי, שמעו נא כל העמים וראו מכאובי, בתולותי ובחורי הלכו בשבי. קראתי למאהבי המה רימוני, כהני וזקני בעיר גבהו, כי ביקשו אוכל למו וישיבו את נפשם. ראה אדוני כי צר לי מאי חמרמרו, נפח ליבי בקרבי, כי מרו מריתי. מחוץ שקלה חרב, בבית כמוות. שמעו כי נאנחה אני, אין מנחם לי. כל אויבי שמעו רעתי ששו, כי אתה עשית. הבאת יום קראת ויהיו כמוני. תבוא כל רעתם לפניך ועולה למו, כאשר עוללת לי על כל פשעי. כי רבות אנחותי וליבי דבר.
I'll now read some selections from chapters 2 and 3 and 4, beginning with chapter 2, verse 1. Echa, alas, the Lord in God's wrath has shamed fair Zion, has cast down from heaven to earth the majesty of Israel. God did not remember God's footstool on God's day of wrath. The Lord has laid waste without pity all the habitations of Jacob. God has raised in God's anger fair Judah's strongholds. God has brought low in dishonor the kingdom and its leaders. In blazing anger, God has cut down all the might of Israel. God has withdrawn God's right hand in the presence of the foe. God has ravaged Jacob like flaming fire, consuming on all sides. God bent God's bow like an enemy, poised God's right hand like a foe, slew all who delighted the eye, poured out God's wrath like fire in the tent of fair Zion. The Lord has acted like a foe, has laid waste Israel, laid waste all her citadels, destroyed her strongholds. God has increased within fair Judah mourning and moaning. God has stripped God's booth like a garden, has destroyed God's tabernacle. The Lord has ended in Zion festival and Sabbath. In God's raging anger has spurned king and priest. The Lord has rejected God's altar, disdained God's sanctuary, has handed over the foe the walls of the citadels. They raised a shout in the house of the Lord as on a festival day. Now turn to chapter 3, first verse. I am the man who has known affliction under the rod of God's wrath. Me, God drove on in unrelieved darkness. On none but me, God brings down God's hand again and again without cease. God has worn away my flesh and skin. God has shattered my bones. All around me, God has built misery and hardship, has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead, has walled me in and I cannot break out, has weighed me down with chains, and when I cry and plead, God has shut out my prayer, has walled in my ways with hewn blocks, has made my paths a maze. But this, continuing in verse 21, but this do I call to mind. Therefore I have hope. The kindness of the Lord has not ended. God's mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning. Ample is your grace. The Lord is my portion, I say with a full heart. Therefore I will hope in God. The Lord is good to those who trust, to those who seek God. It is good to wait patiently till rescue comes from the Lord. It is good for a man when young to bear a yoke, to let him sit alone and be patient when God has laid it upon him. Let him put his mouth to the dust. There may be yet hope. Let him offer his cheek to the smiter. Let him be surfeited with mockery. For the Lord does not reject forever, but first afflicts, then pardons in God's abundant kindness. For God does not willfully bring grief or affliction to man, crushing under God's feet all the prisoners of the earth. To deny a man his rights in the presence of the Most High, to wrong a man in his cause, this the Lord does not choose. Whose decree was ever fulfilled unless the Lord willed it? Is it not at the word of the Most High that weal and woe befall? Of what shall a living man complain? Each one only of his own sins. Continue at the beginning of chapter 4. Alas, the gold is dulled, debased the finest gold. The sacred gems are spilled at every street corner. The precious children of Zion, once valued as gold, alas, they are accounted as earthen pots, work of a potter's hands. Even jackals offer the breast and suckle their young. But my poor people has turned cruel, like ostriches in the desert. The tongue of the suckling cleaves to its palate for thirst. Little children beg for bread, none gives them a morsel. Those who feasted on dainties lie famished in the streets. Those who were reared in purple have embraced refuse heaps. The guilt of my poor people exceeded the iniquity of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment without a hand striking it. Her elect were purer than snow, whiter than milk. Their limbs were ruddier than coral. Their bodies were like sapphire. Now their faces are blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become dry as wood. Better off were the slain of the sword than those slain by famine, who pined away as though wounded for lack of the fruits of the field. With their own hands, tender-hearted women have cooked their children. Such became their fare in the disaster of my poor people. In the beginning of chapter 5, remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Behold and see our disgrace. Our heritage has passed to aliens, our homes to strangers. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay to drink our own water, obtain our own kindling at a price. We are hotly pursued. Exhausted, we are given no rest. We hold out a hand to Egypt, to Assyria, for our fill of bread. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we must bear their guilt. Slaves are ruling over us, with none to rescue us from them. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin glows like an oven with fever of famine. They have ravished women in Zion, maidens in the towns of Judah. Princes have been hanged by them. No respect has been shown to elders. Young men must carry millstones, and youths stagger under the loads of wood. The old men are gone from the gate. The young men are gone from their music. Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing is turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us that we have sinned. We conclude chanting from verse 17.
And just letting you know that the last verse, the Hashivenu verse, second to last verse, Hashivenu, traditionally we re-chant that at the end, which is why we prepared with the song. Libenu, al eile choshchu eineinu, al har Tzion sheshamem, shu'alim hilchu vo. Ata Adonai leolam teshev, kisacha ledor vador. Lama lanetzach tishkachenu, ta'azvenu leorech yamim. Hashivenu Adonai elecha, v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Ki ima'os mezastanu, katzavta aleinu ad me'od. Hashivenu Adonai elecha, v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. Hashivenu Adonai elecha, v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem. And now I am going to say the blessing for after reading from the Scroll of Lamentations. I don't think it's in your Siddur. I didn't find it in there. So, נחם אדוני אלוהינו את אבלי ציון ואת אבלי ירושלים, העיר אשר בלעו לגיונות. Comfort, O God, the mourners of Zion, the mourners of Jerusalem. Legions devoured her. Idolaters took possession of her. They put thy people Israel to the sword and wantonly slaughtered the faithful servants of God Most High. With fire was Zion destroyed, but with fire wilt thou, O God, rebuild her. As it is said, quote, I will be to her, says God, a wall of fire round about, and for as it is glory, I will be in the midst of her, unquote. We praise you, O God, who comforts Zion and is rebuilding Jerusalem. Baruch atah Adonai, menachem Zion, uvoneh Yerushalayim.
Amen. And Yashikoah, this concludes our commemoration of Tisha B'Av here at PJTC. I want to express my gratitude to Cantor Aviva Rosenblum for joining me this evening. Just a quick P. Tzadek a public a public fasting announcement for anyone who is considering fasting. Make sure you are healthy enough to do so. Our sages have decreed that if it is unhealthful for you to fast, you are forbidden from doing so. And fast responsibly. Make sure somebody else knows what you're doing. If you need to take medicine. And for those who are fasting, I wish you a tzom kal, an easy fast, and we'll see you in happier days. Thank you for joining us here at BJTC.
One last song.
Yeah, let's do that.
Song number 4.
Let me pull that up.
But Judah shall be inhabited forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation.
Amen.
V'Yehuda le'olam teshev. V'Yehuda le'olam teshev. V'Yerushalayim ledor vador. V'Yerushalayim ledor vador. V'Yehuda le'olam teshev. V'Yehuda le'olam teshev. V'Yerushalayim ledor vador. V'Yerushalayim ledor vador.
Thanks again for joining us here at Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center. Thank you so much for joining me, Cantor Aviva. And thank you, Hannah. I'm going to turn off the live stream now.